I remember the old man showing me around the building. He was so proud of it, like a child with the biggest dollhouse in the world. Of course, this was after his corporation had secured my release from jail. Well, it's very empty. I'd expected a higher security profile. It's all electronic, Dr. Woodrue. Silicone sentries and digital dogs. I control everything from a console no bigger than a checkerboard. Spares me a lot of grief with labor relations. Through here. He's in here? How long is he? About 2 weeks. He's been here since we shot him. Well, Dr. Woodrue, don't be afraid. Open it up. There, gray, brittle, tattooed by frost, quite dead. This was my first glimpse of the Swamp Thing. Beautiful drawing of his frozen, bullet-riddled corpse, if that's even the right word for a Swamp Thing. And this was once a human being? His name was Alec Holland. He was a doctor like yourself. He was doing some government work, developing something called a biorestorative formula, which was intended to promote crop growth. The experiment was sabotaged. There was an explosion. Holland and his chemical soup went into the swamp where the project was located. This is what came out. You mentioned Linda Holland? His wife and co-worker. You know these people, liberal, equal relationships, caring and sharing. His wife was shot and killed shortly after Holland vanished in the explosion. She's the reason you're here, Woodrue. You see, we got interested in this formula that Holland had been working on, so we had her exhumed. It made sense after all. Apart from her husband, she was the only human who had been exposed to the formula. She'd been working with this stuff for months. We figured it may have permeated her cellular structure just through the repeated skin contact. So we dug her up. We had some people poke around a little. You know what we found? Nothing. Oh, the formula collected in her body. It just hadn't done anything. No reason why it should, of course. The formula wasn't designed to affect human tissue, just plants. Except that doesn't explain our friend in the cryo chest, does it? We'd assumed that the formula had somehow turned Holland into a plant. If it doesn't affect human tissue, that is patently impossible. You begin to see why we arranged your release from jail, Dr. Woodrue. Speaking of which, I believe it's time that we saw your credentials. That isn't your skin, is it? My files say it's artificial. You can dissolve it. Your files are very accurate, General. There. Are you satisfied? Perfectly. You're Woodrue. You're the Floronic Man. When can you start? I started the next day. The old reptile knew I'd start the next day. He knew I'd do damn well anything he pleased if it kept me out of prison. The old reptile. I wonder if he's pounding yet. Pounding on the glass, his fist like withered little apples. I started the next day with the autopsy. I remember clearly the moment before I began to cut. I was very excited. Since the biochemical fluke that had transformed me, I had longed for a chance to examine another human-vegetable hybrid I could learn so much about myself. I'd heard of the legendary Swamp Man, of course. It was that awful book by. Was her name Tremaine? Yeah, I think so, Tremaine. I'd often fantasized about the chance to examine such an organism close up. And this was as close as one was likely to get. I opened him up. He had things inside of him. This is one of the things that makes Alan Moore so brilliant, is that Floronic Man is just a peripheral character in the DC universe. Barely anyone would cite him as being a major character or a major villain or anything. Kind of the male version of Poison Ivy, except Poison Ivy is sexy and a Batman villain, so everyone knows her. But by making this incredible correlation, oh, he's part plant, part man, somehow this desire to discover more about himself through the Swamp Thing, Alan Moore brings just so much more depth to this character and makes him incredibly relevant to this story. And it's just typical of what Alan Moore was able to do with taking really peripheral, underdeveloped characters in the DC universe and turning them into something amazing. There were 2 large pod-like structures within the chest cavity. What are they? His lungs or something? No, they look like lungs, but human lungs have tiny capillary tubes that let oxygen pass through into the blood. That's what lungs are for. These are vegetable fiber. Vegetable fibers are too coarse to allow molecules of oxygen through in that way. These things suck and blow, and they don't do anything else. They don't work. They're not lungs. I wonder what they are. I wonder the same thing about the sponge-like vegetable brain that we found inside the leathery skull. Even without the bullet hole, it couldn't possibly have worked. It had no synapse gaps. I wondered about the useless heart. I wondered about the unworkable pseudo-kidneys. I wondered how long I could keep on drawing blanks before the old man sent me back to jail. I wondered. There were long weeks, long and fruitless. I saw a lot more of the old man, my distaste ripening toward loathing with each encounter. In the evening, when the minimal staff had gone home, he would stroll proudly around that huge and empty tomb of a building. Sometimes he'd insist that I accompany him. He'd talk about the electronic security, about how all the doors were controlled from his office. Sometimes he'd talk to me about career prospects. The word freak was used at least once. Jail was mentioned. I stood there, and I took it. And every night I came back to these special apartments that he'd rented for me. Every morning I set to work hauling organs that couldn't work out of a body that had never needed them. The biorestorative formula had turned Holland into a plant, except that it couldn't have. It didn't work on human tissue. The Swamp Thing had organs like those of any living creature, except that they did not, could not, and had not been designed to function. It was more than a human mind could be expected to unravel. I had the answer within 6 weeks, being not entirely a human mind, but also a little bit lucky. It was as if the clouds were suddenly blown away. I was working late. I was tired. I opened a reference book at the wrong page and began to read. It was an essay on planarian worms. Not what I wanted at all. And then suddenly, there it was, as plain as the nose on your face. Kind of amusing because basically the nose on his face is getting washed off in the shower, or in the rain, I should say. Whatever he's in. The answer. My skin is dry. Outside is raining. I'm thinking of the liver-spotted fingers clawing at unbreakable glass. I'm thinking about the old man there in his office when I went to tell him of my discovery late this afternoon. I'm thinking about melting frost and trickling water and something strong and soft and green thrusting through the dead and petrified grayness. The old man has no one but himself to blame. He didn't understand. Even when I explained it to him, he didn't listen. Well, Dr. Woodrue, I'm listening. Planarian worms, General. They're the key to everything. Oh my God, it's so obvious. He's actually so happy because he's a scientist and he came up with this amazing discovery. And of course, Sunderland doesn't care. He really doesn't care. You see, a while ago, some people did an experiment. They taught a planarian worm to run a simple maze. They educated it. Then they just chopped it up, fed its remains to a batch of planarian worms that couldn't run the maze, except that after digesting their educated comrade, the worms could run the maze perfectly. Don't you see, General? The implication is that consciousness and intelligence can be passed on as foodstuffs. That maybe explains the custom among cannibal tribes of eating the wise man after his death in order to receive his wisdom. General, you could go to a delicatessen and order Einstein on pumpernickel. Dr. Woodrue, I am becoming angry. You talk about worms, you talk about cannibals. None of this has anything to do with Holland. None of this has anything to do with the job I'm paying you for. All right, General. All right. Let's talk about Holland. Let's talk about his accident. Imagine him regaining consciousness there in his cabin that night. Tick, 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 tick. There's something taped to the underside of his workbench. With mounting apprehension, he scrabbles towards it. It's dynamite, 5 sticks of it, and he's maybe 18 inches away from it when it explodes. Tick, tick, click. The combined effects of the blast and the reflex muscles in his legs propel him through the door and into the swamp. But Alec Holland is already dead. His body goes into the swamp along with the formula that it was saturated with, and once there, it decomposes. A batch of swampland like that would be teeming with microorganisms. It wouldn't take long, General. But what about the plants in the swamp? The plants that have been altered by the biorestorative formula. The plants whose hungry root systems are busily ingesting the mortal remains of Alec Holland. Those plants eat him. They eat him as if he were a planarian worm or a cannibal wise man or a genius on rye. They eat him and they become infected by a powerful consciousness that does not realize it is no longer alive. Imagine that cloudy, confused intelligence, possibly with only the vaguest notion of self trying to make sense of its new environment, gradually shaping the plant cells that now inhabits its shape into a shape that's more comfortable with. It remembers having bones, so it builds itself a skeleton of wood. It remembers having muscles and constructs muscles from supple plant fiber. It remembers having lungs and a heart and a brain, and it does its best to duplicate them. You see, we were wrong, General. We thought that the swamp thing was Alec Holland, somehow transformed into a plant. It wasn't. It was a plant that thought it was Alec Holland. A plant that was trying its level best to be Alec Holland. And that pathetic, misshapen parody downstairs in the cryo chest was the closest that it could get. But there's something else, something very important. You see, if that's a plant that we have down there, Dr. Woodrue, I think I've heard enough. This is an absolutely devastating and brilliant revelation by Alan Moore right here. that kind of is unlike anything that you ever see in comics, and kind of unlike anything in fiction in general, because it's always been the case in comics and even in, traditional genre fiction with a monster character that we empathize with it because the man inside of the monster, whether it's the thing under his lair of a rock, periodically you see Ben Grimm sort of peek through, or Ben Grimm get cured for a day and then inevitably he turns back into the thing, and we really empathize with his plight and his despair of being trapped inside that rocky surface. Or Bruce Banner, who turns into the Hulk and then turns back into Banner, but he's this human being inside this monster. Or even Frankenstein, who was a composite of human parts but still had humanity. This is devastating because all along for the prior 19 issues and since he was created, you assume that Alec Holland was this man trapped inside the Swamp Thing, And in this case, he's not. Alec Holland was dead. He was completely destroyed. And then the plants just they absorbed his consciousness, his intelligence, and just tried to replicate a human body because that's what his consciousness was comfortable with. That's what it wanted. But they're still just plants that replicated a human life, but they're not Alec Holland. But they thought they were. And so it's just a devastating sort of terrifying sort of outcome in the sense that, this is almost an alien life form, even though it's very much organic and very much from Earth, but it's not Alec Holland. It's not human. There's no human in there. And that just proves even more devastating. Enough, but you can't possibly have grasped all of the ramifications of what I've been saying. You don't have the correct background. And besides, if that is a plant down there, Woodrue, I'm not in your terms an intelligent man. I'm merely shrewd, but being merely shrewd has secured me a vast financial empire, has enabled me to watch while cleverer men went penniless to their graves. True, I may have missed some of the ramifications of your rather muddled little speech, but I grasp the basic principle well enough. That principle, that breakthrough, was all that was needed. There are others who can be paid to see their work through its conclusion. You see, I am very rich. I do not need to be an intellectual. I do not need to understand how this computer works to know that if I push that little button, all the sprinklers start up, or the doors open and close. I do not need the ramifications. I do not need the correct background. And you, Dr. Woodrue, now that you've provided me with my breakthrough, I need you least of all. I have a phone call to make in the outer office. I'll sort out the termination papers when I get back. The implication here being that he's just insulted by Woodrue's intelligence and sense of superiority. So he fires him. But of course, if he has to hire other scientists to continue the work, he still has to hire intellectuals. But maybe he's also sort of prejudiced against Woodrue because Woodrue in his eyes is a freak. He's a mutant of sorts. But still, it doesn't quite make sense other than he's just insulted. And that's how the old man fired me, just like that. Then he sauntered out of his office, a self-made man, a common man, by God, who just put one over on an uppity intellectual. He was chuckling to himself. So was I. He'd left me alone with his computer, and I understood exactly how it worked. Sunderland hadn't been bragging. From that console, you controlled the whole building. You controlled the elevators, the lights, the switchboards, and the thermostats. Oops. In the freezer units, and the doors. See Swamp Thing defrosting there in a sense. It's starting to melt and then also starting to bloom inside his chest cavity. He's sort of covered in encasing of dead bark. I'm sitting in my apartment outside. It is raining. I am laughing very loudly. Friends have told me it is not a sound conducive to tranquility. I'm thinking about the old man. He'll stay late. When everyone has gone, perhaps he'll read through the notes he wouldn't permit me to keep, skipping the big words. Then maybe he'll want to take a stroll, like every other night, stroll around the biggest dollhouse in the world. He'll punch one of his little buttons to switch the door mechanisms to manual so that he can control them while he's away from his checkerboard. Then he'll strut proudly down the hall and think how lucky he is to have all this. He should have let me finish. He should have listened. Then I'd have been able to explain the most important thing of all to him. I'd have been able to explain that you can't kill a vegetable by shooting it through the head. Oh, you could give it such a shock that it would plunge into cellular coma. You could keep it in that state by placing it in a freezer unit, but you couldn't kill it. Really, the old man could have worked that out for himself. He just didn't have the correct background. I wonder what he's doing now. I wonder how long he'll be able to resist going down there and taking a look. Perhaps he'll be in time to see it, the gray husk splintering and tearing, the raw, wet, implacable greenness beneath. Perhaps he'll reach the basement in time to actually see it. Or perhaps not.